Toussaint is a poet, my tendency is to believe that this notion that he has of consent not to be a single being is, for me, I think of that as like, I'm tempted to talk about that as like a fundamental feature of what you might call poetic method. To be possessed, to hear voices, to hear other voices, to allow those other voices to infuse, your life as a person and as a writer. This seems to me to be open to the outside. To be able to conceive of oneself as a thing in the midst of other things, and to be open to the weight and the force of those other things. This for me is all bound up with poetry, and it's also implicit in that is another mode of being in the world, another mode of being social in the world. You know what I mean? Like another way of being in the world with things. Okay? That doesn't presuppose that things are there for you to grab, right? And to take. It's not that one's presence isn't felt in the world of things, it's just that one's presence is also structured by the things that one is around. Okay, there's a couple, I'll just read maybe like a page or two, half a page. And this is the middle part of my paper. And the last part was all this stuff about flesh and body, which I kind of got to. And the first part was all that stuff about the brain and the computer, which I guess I sort of semi got to. So this is the middle part. And I'll just read it. It's basically, so that the thing about this middle part is it occurs as a function of an amazing coincidence. And the coincidence is teaching Bessie Phillips' poem Zong at the same time that I was sort of volunteering in my son's kindergarten. And recognizing a tremendous kind of interesting affinity between the different ways in which language was being worked with and played with in these two spaces. And particularly thinking about this in relation to my son and his own sort of special relation to language. Okay, so let's see. Page and a half. There's an unruly interplay of silence and chatter that Ian Balcom's book, Spectres of the Atlantic, replays. There, the Zong's exhausted, inspiriting cargo, 132 or 143 or 150 persons. Documentation of the number always changes, as if marking an insistent incalculability. 150 persons thrown into the sea, whose trace was buried in the hold of the official language and documents of the governmental and financial entities that authored their disappearance. Enacts its emergence and meta-emergence again. Thinking but also living between silence and chatter persists on other registers in all languages. Not only the silencing of things, the silence of an unheard case, of a muffled appeal consigned to lower frequencies, of disrupted wave and terminally colliding particle where no one can observe. And not only that other effect that constantly nascent and dying capitalism and colonialism produces, the ceaseless chatter of administration, regulation, and what Balcom calls phenomenal busyness, but also the silence and chatter of song, which thinkers have been known to misrecognize as an unbearable lightness, but also the hard, sweet life of language on the spectrum, for I am an initiate under the protection of my son. He moves between silence and chatter, for the set pieces of adults usually reserved for the forced participation of kids breaks down in the face of constant contact improvisation that you have to be ready for. The brilliant surprise of the silly ABCs. B, A, D, C, F, E, H. Sung to the rhythm and melody of the old tune, or the belated christening of a dinosaur, the proto-cereal box, his bones discovered in illicit breakfast reading, must be heard to be believed. But those in positions, how old are you? Are you ready for Santa Claus? Are you strong? Show me your muscles. Do you like school? Aren't the only scripts, all of which aren't so easily done without. Every returned I love you is treasure when every incalculable gift was occasioned by an unimaginable loss, and when the gift is often harder to accept, or would be, if it weren't for what you had already been given by poems, which Charles Bernstein, thinking about Robin Blazer, calls the flowers of associational thinking. Lorenzo gives me a fresh bouquet every day as I learn to stop mourning for something I never had. One of the hard parts of caring for a child with an autism spectrum disorder is the problem of where they should go to school. And if you're picky about school to the point of not believing in it, even though you love it so much you never want to leave it, if you're so committed to the conservation of the strange and beautiful that your mistrust of the normal is redoubled to a level of intensity that can't actually keep up with your desire for your child to have a normal life, then the general necessity of the alternative school, which may have been a principle you've been trying to live by, now becomes concrete and absolute. It requires you to go back to first grade, at least every Tuesday morning, in order to play and get dirty and paint and make bird baths and talk about princesses. Lorenzo and I facilitate communication with the other kids for one another out in the woods, where all those flowers grow. On Tuesday afternoon, I go to school with the big kids, whose interest in those flowers often goes against the grain of their schooling, where critical and creative attendance upon both silence and chatter is frowned upon in the interest of a whole other kind of preparation. In the afternoon, we try to read Zong. This means we get together to decide how to get together to decide how to read. A collective enterprise is implied here. I don't think anybody can do it by themselves. Phillips's memorial bouquet, faded, fading, murmured, submerged, displaced, misspaced, overlaid, is an effect of a range of superimposition exposed as beauty, the amplification of an associational field that evokes the mutual aid that it also requires, the terrible intimacy of the irreparable, where everything is less and more than itself. I skip to the end part. There's this amazing stuff about flesh, by the way, in Zong, y'all remember, page 128, that section called Pharaoh, where she starts it off with a quote from Ezekiel. When we immerse ourselves in Zong, throw ourselves into its terrible analytic of flesh, its beautiful analytic of being thrown, we are the Turing machine, dedicated to the thinking of the incalculable, suspended in the brake of computation, held on the other side and always being sent, saturated in what Edouard Glissant, speaking of the middle passage as an insistent and ongoing worrying of inauguration, calls the consent not to be a single being. Still in movement, in the quartet's sober enthusiasm, from which the soloist flashes as striated glide, to introduce us once again to our multiplicity, which reminds me of a little girl named Micah, noted for her refusal of administration, her resistance to calculation, her tendency to get in over her head. She keeps caringly, carefully, not taking care of herself with others all the time. It's so exorbitantly common that she keeps folks worried about her executive and her administrator, who seem too often to go on tour. One day, standing in front of Apollo Place in a tree, almost big enough for them to enter, Micah said to my boy, "Come on, Lorenzo, let's take a walk into the future."